Welcome, Dr. Waldron, to the Missing Pillar of Health podcast. I am so honored to have you here today, and I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thanks for inviting me.
To start things off, can you share a little bit about you, your research and work that you've done to date?
Sure. I was born in Montreal and came to Halifax for the first time in 2008 to do research on, I guess, what is broadly called the social determinants of health, to look specifically at health outcomes in marginalized communities, specifically Indigenous communities, Black communities, and racialized communities. So over the past several years, my research has focused on all aspects of health, including environmental racism and other social determinants of health, and doing much of that research from a community engaged perspective, which is about enabling and facilitating communities to do the work in partnership with me. I also teach in those areas, the social determinants of health, marginalized populations, and I'm also involved in a lot of community advocacy, and I'm a member of various committees and boards in Halifax that is related to my research.
Amazing. And I first learned about social determinants of health from my friend who went through nursing school. And I find it so fascinating because I think so many of us think of the physical and very personal issues with health. Can you maybe expand a little bit on what social determinants of health means?
It's great that you said that your friend who's a nurse learned about it. I had an uphill battle getting across how important this perspective was to nursing students in the beginning, because they're trained in a particular way to prioritize genetics and biology, and getting across the importance of this notion that is actually primarily the factors external to your body that play the biggest role in health outcomes. So the social determinants of health is about how do issues around income, economics, poverty, homelessness, housing insecurity, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, housing insecurity, green space, all of those issues that are factors in our world that are external to our bodies, what role do they play in health outcomes? And what we find in Canada and of course around the world is that those external factors have a greater bearing on health outcomes than genetics and biology. So even when you look at Health Canada website, they used to have a pie chart. I don't know if they have a pie chart anymore, but that pie chart indicated that the biggest determinant of health are those factors outside your body. And that was the biggest slice of the pie on the diagram. And genetic and biology, it was a small slice of the pie. So while it was certainly a challenge in the beginning to get this across, I think, and what I'm seeing over the past 10 years now in Canada, is that people have come on board in terms of that perspective. Certainly health professionals, but other people are understanding that the social determinants of health, that's where we need to look if we're going to understand health outcomes, but if we're going to address it, that in addressing it, we have to address it for the most part outside the health system, not inside the health system. Certainly it's both, but it's primarily, if we're saying that health outcomes are due to external factors, then we need to put our focus on structures and institutions that are creating poor health in the first place.
There's a quote that I referenced in a few of my presentations by Dr. Sonia Mather: genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And I think that she goes in to explain more of the epigenetics and the manifestation of disease, and how, we used to think that genetics played the major role, but we're seeing such a sharp incline in the rates of incidences of these diseases that can't be explained by genetics, because that takes time, right? So I'm sad that it's been taking so long for it to get kind of more recognition and acceptance, but happy to hear that it is starting to have that shift in the medical field specifically. And I'm so glad that you are talking about this and teaching kind of the next generation of healthcare providers this information.
Yeah.
And along those lines, I would love to hear about your mental health research, because I think this is, I focus a lot on environmental health, specifically toxins, and helping families reduce their toxic load from changes that they can make in their daily lives. But to be able to learn and engage and make changes, we need to be able to learn and take in that information and then act on it. And I think mental health
Oh, you're gone now. I don't.
And so you've studied Black. Oh, did I freeze?
Yes.
Where did I end up?
Changes in your home.
Okay, I will go back. My editor can deal with that.
Okay. Oh, good. There's an editor. Good.
Yes. Yeah, I forgot to say, if you need to stop or restart, by all means. Okay, I'll just start again. So along those lines, I would love to hear more about your mental health research, because I think this is such a critical piece of the environmental health puzzle. And the work that I do is helping families lower their toxic load with changes that they can affect in their daily lives. But in order to do that, you need to have a certain ability to take in that information and then act on it. And I think mental health plays a substantial barrier to this. And you've studied Black women's experiences with mental health issues specifically. Can you touch on what you found?
I would say that my mental health research is broad. So there's a component of it which has nothing to do with the environment. Yes. And there's another component of it that has to do with health and mental health outcomes of living near to polluting industries. So with my PhD, it's very interesting that I ended up focusing on environmental issues, because that was not the focus of my PhD and my postdoctoral work. My PhD focused on way back on Black women's mental illness in Toronto. And I did a postdoc after that on the same topic, but focused a little bit more on coping. And when I came to Nova Scotia, of course, it changed drastically to environmental racism. That was a huge shift, although there are connections to mental health. But I've continued to do work in mental illness, and I specifically focus on how inequities, discrimination within our social structures impact health or mental health and well-being among diverse communities. And I've often liked to focus on the issue of gender, because I like to incorporate an intersectional framework in everything that I do. And because my postdoc and my doctoral work were on Black women's mental health issues, I wanted to continue that work, and I've started to do that again recently over the past year. So the study that I recently completed, I'm very excited about it, because the data is going to be used to inform a new health service for Black women in the HRM, which would be groundbreaking. I don't think there's any such service in Canada. So it extends on my PhD work to look at Black women in Halifax Regional Municipality, and to look at issues of poverty, socioeconomic status, LGBTQ issues, disability. How do those issues, and race, of course, and culture, how do those issues converge to shape experiences that Black women have in terms of accessing mental health services, and in terms of how it has impacted them personally and in their community. A part of it also looks at stigma, belief systems around mental illness and how it should be treated in their communities, and the taboo, in many cases, of mental illness in their communities that often prevents them from actually seeking help. So, like most of the research I conduct, as I said, there's a practical aspect to it. If we could have a health service that includes mental health, of course, for Black women specifically, that hires Black women or women who look like them, who understand their culture, who understands their experiences, then that would be, for me, worth it in actually doing this research. So I'm going to continue doing research on mental illness that may be independent of environmental issues.
Right.
But I also look at mental health with respect to environmental racism. I think there's a focus on looking at the impact of environmental racism on the body.
Mhm.
So talking about high rates of cancer in Indigenous and Black communities, talking about reproductive illnesses or reproductive cancers, specifically higher rates in among Indigenous women, respiratory illnesses. There are studies out there, Canadian studies, that have indicated that communities that are closer to toxic waste tend to have higher rates of these illnesses. But I also want to look at the mental health impacts of it, because I feel that studies in Canada haven't done that. And in speaking with the communities that I've spoken with, they would say to me often, just living near that dump, Ingrid, it's stigmatizing. We live near the dump, but people also see us as the dump. And that has taken a psychological toll on us in many ways. The stress of living near to polluting industries, not knowing what you're drinking, what's in your water, is particularly stressful. And that was communicated to me by folks in Lincolnville who have been near a first generation and second generation landfill since 1974. They have high rates of cancer, but they've also said that, we have a lot of stress because we don't know what's in the water. I'm fearful of drinking the water. As one member said to me, my husband died of, I think, colon cancer and prostate cancer. I know it's because he drank the water. I'm not going to drink the water. So I think what's missing in the research is looking at the psychological impact of living near to these industries, whether or not I see yourself as somebody who has been stigmatized in many ways, living near to a dump, which causes low self-esteem in many of these communities that are already, they're racialized communities, they're low-income communities, they live in isolated communities, and then on top of that, they're living next to a dump. That creates low self-esteem among many individuals. And I've been told that, many of these communities, there are issues with substance dependence and, depression and anxiety, and some of it due to the fact that they're living in a community that's near a dump. An ecological eco-grief, or eco-grief, as we call it, resulting from climate change impacts. Like, these are really interesting topics that I want to venture into, because I see from my research that they're missing in the literature. Researchers are starting to do this work, but I see a really perfect place for me to really get into those areas. So your mental health is everywhere. And I'm trying, increasingly to capture mental illness and mental health issues with respect to all of the research that I'm conducting at Dalhousie.
That's really exciting. I'm excited to follow along with that, because I think, going back to the social determinants of health, it ends up being a cycle, right? If you're stuck in these stress states or stigmatized states or in a mental health crisis, you're not going to seek support for other issues, and it ends up just perpetuating itself, right? And I think that speaks to how multifaceted environmental health really is, because all of the issues that you've touched on, even though you didn't start studying mental health with this lens, it is certainly related. And so you talked a bit about environmental racism. Can we dive into more of a definition of what that is? You've touched on it in bits and pieces, but just so we can have it kind of in one definition, what does it mean?
Environmental racism refers to the disproportionate siting or location of polluting industries and other environmentally hazardous projects in indigenous communities, Black communities, and other racialized communities. But that could also include white communities, particularly low-income white communities living in rural or isolated places. It's not typical, it's primarily racialized communities, but there's a community, and there are other communities, I'm sure, across Canada. So there's a community here in Nova Scotia called Harrietsfield, which is a low-income white community in a rural area. And they've been trying to address water contamination since the mid-1980s, right? Wow. So we can include them in that definition of environmental racism. When we think about environmental racism, it's essentially about who has power and who does not have power to resist the siting of these toxic waste dumps and other sites in their communities. So these are not communities that are members of the political or economic elite. Quite the contrary, they tend to be low income, in many cases poor, living in isolated rural areas. We understand poverty and socioeconomic status as factors that often strip you of power. But we also have to understand, of course, that rural communities are often stripped of power. They're out of the way. They're often not recognized. They're invisible, oftentimes, to policymakers and politicians. They tend to be forgotten. So when you look at those intersections of being part of a racialized community and also low income or poor and living in an isolated area or a rural area, those issues, those identities converge in a way that it makes it much more challenging for you to address environmental racism or to be heard by government. So when we think about that definition of environmental racism, the disproportionate siting or location of industries in these communities is those communities that we're talking about, those communities that sit at the intersection of race, of class, of income, and of rural living in many ways. Another aspect of the environmental racism definition is the notion that these communities are less, as I just said, less able to fight back. They have less clout. And also the fact that it takes much longer for them to seek cleanup in their communities. So certainly if they have, once again, more power, economic clout, political clout, they will often find that, or communities who do will often find that they get cleanup at faster rates than communities who are lower income. Another aspect of the definition is the fact that the communities that tend to be most impacted by environmental racism always tend to be the communities that are not sitting on those environmental NGOs or boards or committees or regulatory bodies. You know, who do we see in power, or who do we see sitting on those committees and boards? Who do we see working at ENGOs? It's typically people from educated, white, middle class backgrounds. And if we are saying, or if we know that racialized communities are disproportionately impacted and they're not sitting alongside us making decisions, policy decisions, then environmental racism continues to manifest over time because we never hear from the people who are most impacted. So how do we make policies that don't embed the views and priorities and perspectives of the people who are most impacted? How do we make those policies and make them work if we're not hearing from the communities who are most impacted? So in many ways, that allows environmental racism, for me, to continue over generations. So the challenge is, how do we reach out to those communities in culturally specific ways so we can incorporate their priorities and their perspectives and their experiences on the ground into what we do?
That's an important point. I think the multi-generational challenge, and it really comes down to trauma at that point and a stress response over generations, which again compounds the health issues that you've already been dealing with living near these toxic sites. I think it might be helpful to walk through how you approached this. And I want people to watch or read There's Something in the Water, your book, which then was turned into a film. It is really well done. Can you talk about that example? Because I think it would be helpful to kind of frame the concept of what these communities are going through and what the process looks like in navigating the regulations and the industries that are involved in these sites.
I would say that I entered this project of environmental racism with a lot of hesitance because once again, it wasn't my area. But I recognized early on that it needed to be community-based and I needed to engage communities. And in many ways, they needed to, direct the research alongside me. So for me, it was about visiting and getting to know and developing relationships over time with Indigenous and Black communities that I didn't really have that much relationship with because I was new to Nova Scotia. So I spent some time forming a team, multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral team that included professors in different departments and community leaders and ENGOs and students, et cetera, et cetera. It was extremely diverse. And I visited the communities to hold informal workshops or meetings, I would say, to ask them what their priorities were. I didn't want to delve into this topic or the research without hearing from them first. I mean, that's an important component of community-based research. And I do that now for everything that I do. So I heard from them and they told me what their priorities were, what they felt that I needed to look at, rather than me as a professor deciding what I should look at. They told me exactly what they wanted me to look at. And that was 2013 or 2012. And I've continued to do that work, and that work includes many things. The Enrich Project includes research, yes, but there are also communities that don't want me to do research. And while some professors might walk away and say, my job is research, you know, I recognize that if they don't want me to do research, I'm not going to do research. Are there other ways I can help? Should I send out their GoFundMe page or their petition, whatever they're doing, or advocacy or activism, whatever they're doing, how can I support that without having to do research? Because they don't want research. So it's a kind of a different way to conceptualize research in many ways, that research could be not research. So with the Enrich Project, I set out just trying to create awareness about the particular issue by organizing workshops and public engagement events in Nova Scotia and in Halifax specifically, trying to create awareness, because I know that creating awareness actually increases people's empathy around a topic. People were skeptical when I started the work. They didn't understand how the environment could be racist. And I realized I had a lot of work to do in terms of raising awareness, and then people can be empathic. Once they're empathic, they're more likely to want to act. Much of that work has also included trying to get an environmental racism legislation passed. I worked with MP Lenore Zan in 2015 on a provincial environmental racism bill that went to second reading, but that never turned into legislation. Tonight, she is actually putting to second reading Bill C-230, which is a federal environmental racism bill that she's putting forward in the House of Commons. And that is a revised version of the bill that I developed with her in 2015. So part of the work for me is, and a missing piece of the puzzle is environmental racism legislation. I try to support civil disobedience as well. The communities are very much engaged in civil disobedience and rallies and marches in order to be heard by government and other people. I recognize that that's an important part of the work that I do. I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket. In the beginning, I thought legislation was the only thing. And now I realize that addressing the issue happens from multiple approaches. When the film came out, I think a lot of the success or the achievements that I've seen over the past, since December of last year, had a lot to do with the film. So I also put stock in film. I put stock in multimedia. I put stock in social media. The Enrich Project engages with multimedia. It always has. I find it interesting. I like to think of creative ways to address the issue, but I recognize also that people engage in an issue in different ways. They learn in different ways. They don't necessarily want to read my book. How do I get to people in very distinct ways? So what I've seen over the past, I guess, 10 months or since December, what we've all seen was the closure of the mill that was pumping effluent into Boat Harbor since 1967. We saw Sabaganagati First Nation win their appeal. And now they've asked government to go back to consult with them, and the government, the court ordered the government to go back to consult with them. We've seen Shelburne, a Black community in Nova Scotia, receive wells from the Housing Authority, a well from Ellen Elliott Page. And they also closed their landfill at the end of 2016. So there have been so many milestones and achievements, and I think it has much to do with the multi-method approach that I've used, but also I want to give credit to communities and the decades-long organizing, activism, advocacy that the communities that I'm working with have engaged in, that to me has moved forward the issue in many ways and created awareness as well. So that's been my journey in terms of I'm somebody who's open to doing everything and anything to address the issue as long as it makes sense, because I've seen how it's worked over the past few years.
And I think legislation is the ultimate end goal for a lot of these issues when it comes to environmental health and toxins in general, but it is such a slow process that to rely on it entirely, it's not fast enough for the severity of the issues that we're dealing with, right?
Yes.
And I think that's where people get kind of stuck in the blame game and saying, oh, well, it's up to government or it's up to industry. And what they're forgetting is that we're the ones who vote in government and we're the ones who buy stuff from industry.
Yes.
And recognizing that we actually hold all of the power to control both of those entities, I think is a critical piece of this. And if we just say push towards that legislation as the only mechanism, it's going to be too late. So I love that you broke down kind of the multi faceted approach to this. And I think the conversations in the film with the women and the community members was quite eye-opening as well. I think being Canadian and especially the East Coast, like it's thought to be this very friendly, happy-go-lucky kind of place. I love Halifax, and I think we are very quick to point the finger at what's going on in the States or other areas, but recognizing what's going on in our own backyard and in these communities and what these people have been going through. I think the film did an excellent job at shedding light on that, and the work that you're doing with the Enrich project. I love that kind of community aspect to your research. Are you sharing any of that community-based research? Does that lend itself to support the community-based policy making that needs to ultimately happen? Is there some connection there?
Not necessarily community-based policy making, but policy making happening right now, for example, at Nova Scotia Environment. So they're looking at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals Act. They're writing, I believe, or developing a new one. The last one was in 2017, and they need to update it. And I was last week called upon to provide input. So that tells me truly too that we're making strides, because they want to know, okay, what is environmental? How can we incorporate environmental racism or the communities that Ingrid's been working with into this? And I've never ever been called upon in the past to provide my ideas. So the fact that Nova Scotia Environment has asked me for input tells me that we're making strides. So I wouldn't say there's necessarily community policies. I would say what's really important is to have policies at Nova Scotia Environment. They're responsible for approving many of these environmentally dangerous projects. The fact that they're calling on me now means that they're taking it a bit more seriously.
It's shifting in the right direction.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to working more closely with Nova Scotia Environment in the future. I think there was perhaps hesitance in the past, or fear that, of course there's fear, because what does Ingrid ultimately want? She wants you to halt these projects, but then you benefit from it. It brings profit. Like this issue is really challenging for me and other people in the environment field, because we're asking government to halt projects, to stop putting those pipelines in Indigenous communities, but they make profit from it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when I think of Nova Scotia Environment, I think perhaps over the past few years, it was like, you don't want to necessarily hear from Ingrid, because she's going to want us to halt these projects. And we don't know we're not really sure whether or not we're selecting certain communities for it. We're just selecting the best places to put these industries in, but Ingrid's suggesting that it's racialized communities and that we're doing that on purpose. So I can see why they would be hesitant to meet with me.
Is
But I
that why
truly,
an article I read said that you got pretty disparaging emails early on in your research? Is that where
I
that
have to be
came
honest that
from?
I didn't get a lot. I have colleagues who are working in the areas of racism and they get DMs and their Twitter messages and things that I don't get. Like they get frightening stuff. So
Okay.
I would say that I have never gotten frightening stuff that, you know, people threatening to kill me. But I've gotten people who just simply question the reality of environmental racism. They would say to me, this is about class. Why are you making it about race? Comments like that, which is why I wrote my book. My book was about looking at exploring the journeys of Indigenous and Black communities who have been organizing around this issue, but it was also kind of a response to people over the years who have questioned what I'm doing, or who believe that I'm making it about race when it shouldn't be, and other things that they've said to me. So they haven't been disparaging in terms, or even threatening in any way, but I think it's people who just needed to be educated around the topic and questioning why I'm making race an issue, and that we're all impacted. They would say to me, we're all impacted by environmental issues. Why aren't you looking at every racial group? Why are you focusing on Indigenous people and Black people? Those kinds of comments. And I would respond to them, I guess. But then I decided, nah, I'm not going to respond anymore. I'm just going to put it all in a book.
You're just going to write a book.
Yeah, the book was my mixtape.
Yeah.
Response.
Well, it seemed to reach the people who it needed to reach, because once now Elliot Page got his hands on it, that seemed to be the kind of catalyst that ended up with the government reaching out to you for input. So it's amazing what can happen when you put yourself out there. So thank you for writing the book and getting that information out there. And I always like to wrap up interviews with some practical and tangible tips for people, you know, as individuals, as consumers, as voters. What can we do to take action to help fight environmental racism? I don't know if that's the right word, to help advocate for better. What are some of the steps that we can take?
I think legislation is key. I think mass support for the bill that's going to be put forward tonight is one way. And I developed a campaign that's online. It's on the Enrich website, where I've got everything for the public there. I've crafted a letter. I've crafted tweets. I've crafted stuff that you can post on LinkedIn or Facebook. It's right there for everyone. I have all of the emails for, you know, Justin Trudeau and the health minister and the environment minister, et cetera, where I don't have that information. I provide another link to it's called Parliament, I think, parliament.ca or something. It has the emails and phone numbers for all of the MPs across Canada. So I think when we have a bill like this that's put forward and there's no response by the public, there's no mobilizing around it, government says to itself, I guess people don't care, you know, so we don't have to worry about this bill. But when we get, and I'm getting it, when we get people writing to Justin, so over the past 2 weeks since I posted that campaign on my website, people are copying me on their emails. It's been great to see, because I've asked them to CC me, and I'm getting it. And they're sending the letters saying it's time for Canada to shape up, and right. So I've gotten quite a few. So that tells me people are writing to them, and of course, you know, we need them to continue to do that until March of next year. But to me, that's
this episode will air in January, so there's still time. I will pop. I'll pop all the links in the show notes for that. And the Enrich website I will put in there as well, just for general resource, because there is so much goodness on that site for learning learning more in general.
Yeah. So I think, you know, when don't let a bill like this fall flat. Like, support it. Contact your MPs and tell them how you feel about it and why you think it's important. I think that's key. While I don't think legislation is everything, I think it is really important because it creates transparency, and it actually forces the government to form a committee to address it. And the things that we are asking, you can see it on the website, are really crucial. Reparations, financial compensation for the communities that have been impacted, the collection of statistical data that looks at socioeconomic status, race, etc., health. This particular legislation that we created has a lot more teeth than the one we created in 2015. So don't let this bill fall flat. I would say that first. The other thing is, I would say supporting communities. And sometimes people would say to me, well, I don't know how, but with the communities I'm working with, if you go onto their Facebook page, on any given day, they will actually send out a request. I think of the communities, Sabaganaganny First Nation. You saw Doreen speaking in the film. They have a fantastic Facebook page called the, two of them, they have the Grassroots Grandmothers Facebook page, and they have Stop Alton Gas. And on a particular day, they might want people to come up and help them build the Treaty Truck House like they did in the past, or to send out a petition or sign a petition or share it, or they're raising funds for legal fees, right? Little things that seem like little things, but really go a long way in terms of supporting them. So I would say that for the public, get onto those Facebook pages of communities in your neighborhood, in your area. If you're in Ontario or whatever province you're in, you need to find out about the communities that are being impacted by environmental racism, learn about it, seek them out through their Facebook pages, be present, go to their communities, get yourself known, have them see your face. Over time, they recognize you, you develop relationships with them. And you know, when people say, how do I become an ally? It's about stepping back a bit, allowing them to drive, to be in control, but coming in where needed. And they often let you know the kinds of supports that they need. And today it's through social media. So for me, it's legislation and supporting the communities on the front lines. Because as you said, actually, it's us who make the difference. The policy is important. But if these communities were not mobilizing and organizing and engaging in civil disobedience to create attention around the issue of environmental racism, the legislation may not happen. It's because we put a spotlight on it. And many of these communities, they've been putting a spotlight on it for decades. That legislation then gets passed because there's pressure coming from the community and other people. So it's about pressure, pressuring the government by sending them letters, pressuring the government by engaging in civil disobedience that gets attention in the media, for example, and that calls on, in a fervent way, calls on government to do something, and doing that persistently. Sometimes we just kind of give up. I see that, you know, people get frustrated, particularly with the environmental sector. It's just frustrating because it seems like it's happening, like we're addressing it very slowly. And people get frustrated. And I remember Lenore Zan, who's putting the bill forward tonight, she said, but Ingrid, people have to keep it up. You know, they do it for a few months and then they kind of let go and they give up. It's tiring, but you got to keep going at it over and over and over again. You've got to be dedicated and you got to be persistent. Or else, once again, government says, okay, guess they're not interested. We don't have to deal with this. We're not hearing from anybody. And then voting, as you said.
Yes.
Voting.
Those are fantastic tips. And that will, I've got listeners across Canada and the US, and that applies no matter where you live. The same issues apply, the same things happen in communities all around the world. So thank you for sharing those insights, summary of your research and work. I am really looking forward to continuing to follow along and see where your kind of next level of research takes you. And I will pop all of the links to your website and the Enrich Project and some of the resources that you talked about and your book and film in the show notes for people to learn more. Is there anything else you want to share before we sign off?
Can't think of anything.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Okay. Do you want me to just sign out now?